was a man who had known nothing but blindness, nothing but darkness for all of his life. The beauty of a sunset, the kind face of his mother, those were just a few of the things his eyes had never had the chance to behold. Life was rough. It was hard to get around. He couldn't do the things that everyone else could do. There was no work for someone like him, at least not at that time. And there was no cure. There was nothing anyone could do. To make matters worse, people suggested that his condition was a curse. It was a punishment from God because someone, either him or his parents, had sinned and God had punished him. I mean, who really knew though, right? And what did it matter? No answer could change anything. It seemed like nothing could change anything. But then Jesus passed by, and meeting Jesus would change everything for this man. His story is one of several that are told within the life of Jesus by the Gospel of John. The book was written by one of Jesus' closest friends, and so he had access to some of these most personal moments in the life of Jesus. So during this series called Face to Face, we are looking at some of these stories of when real people like you and I come face to face with Jesus. The hope is that we would start to see ourselves in these stories, and like those in them, we would be changed. And so we come to this story in John chapter 9. And if you were with us last week, you know that we're taking a leap here. Last week we were in chapter 5. This week we're in chapter 9. We're trying to move pretty quickly through this gospel of Jesus. And so as we are doing so, that means that we can't cover everything. That's why we're encouraging you to keep up and to read along on your own using the 40 Days in the Gospel of John resource that we provided. And so we started this at the beginning of Lent, and so maybe you started then and you've missed several days and you're way behind. Maybe it just passed you by and you didn't start it then. Maybe this is the first you've heard of it, but we would love for you to read the Gospel of John on your own so that you can see the life of Jesus for yourself. And you'll be able to see the whole story rather than the bits that we are able to cover on Sundays. And so if you don't have one of these, we encourage you to pick one up at the Information Center on your way out and start reading. So we get to chapter 9, and to bridge the gap between where we were last week and where we are this week, I can summarize it quite simply that since then, the hype about Jesus has been growing. People are getting more and more excited about the miracles he's performing, the message he's speaking, and so the crowd is becoming enamored with him, and they want to crown Jesus as king. And yet at the same time, as the hype grows, the tension grows between Jesus and the religious leaders. They're irritated with him because first, he's performing miracles on the Sabbath, which is supposed to be their holy day of rest. And also because Jesus, in many different ways, is claiming to be equal to God. And so while the tension grows, the religious leaders want to kill him. The crowds want to crown him. The leaders want to kill him. People are divided about what to do with Jesus. And that becomes the backdrop for our story that will begin in John chapter 9, verse 1. We read about this man here. It says, this is Jesus, as Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. This wasn't all that uncommon because they didn't have the benefit of medical advances that we do, and so oftentimes the process or everything that was included resulted in blindness from birth. It was known to be an especially impossible cure, or a condition to cure. And so this man had been afflicted. Jesus' disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The popular idea of the day was that anyone who had a condition like this was being punished by God. Someone in their family had sinned, and God was taking it out on the child. Jesus responds, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So Jesus neither confirms or denies the popular notion of the day, but rather he says that this man's condition is not because of anyone's sin, but because God is going to do something in this man to reveal himself. And so Jesus is speaking precisely about this man. He's not intending for there to be a universal claim about how God works in different situations. He's not saying that any circumstances, especially these negative ones, is by God's design, or every evil in this world is for God's purpose. What he's saying is that for this man in this moment, God is going to work in such a way so that some will see it. And as a result, some will believe. But it does help us to understand that God can work in any of our situations, in any of our circumstances, not because they are small or insignificant, but because God is big and he is able. So Jesus says that this man's condition is going to become the backdrop for God to display his work. People will see God at work because of this man. So the story continues in verse 6. It says, after saying this, Jesus spit on the ground, he made some mud with the saliva, and he put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. A couple weeks ago, my family was at home, and we had our kids, we set our kids up to use the Bridgepoint Kids version of this 40-day guide in the Gospel of John. And so we decided that because we were reading a story that was a narrative, it was easy for the kids to at least understand or follow along, that they could read it on their own. So Corbin is sitting on the couch, he's reading from his Bible, and all of a sudden I hear him pause for a moment and say to himself under his breath, "Oh, gross." And he was reading this story, and I assume it was at this point, right? He says what we're all thinking. When you read this story, you hear Jesus spit on the ground, and he spits enough to make mud. Do you know how much you have to spit to turn dirt into mud? And so like him, we just want to pause and go, oh, gross, right? And so there may be, I'm sure there was reason to the method of Jesus healing, but that's not so much as important as what's about to happen, right? So Jesus makes this mud, he wipes it on the man's eyes, and he sends him off to wash in this pool. And the man obeys Jesus, and he comes home, not blind, but able to see now. And so my best guess is that Jesus wanted to give this man who could not see a tangible experience, something to represent the miracle as he told his story later. And so this man obeys, he comes home seeing. I like the next part of the story. Verse 8 says, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging, so people who lived near him, people who passed by him as he was begging on the side of the road, because that's all a blind person could do to earn income, people who had seen him previously asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? This man who's walking around looking us in the eye, isn't this the same man we used to know? Some claimed that he was, and others said, nah, he only looks like him. And the man speaks up for himself and says, I am the man. He's like, guys, it's really me. How then were your eyes open, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on his eyes. I want you to pay attention to how he refers to Jesus. At this point, Jesus is just the one they call Jesus, right? He made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. So he represents this simple story. And his friends, neighbors, whoever these people are, they take him to they take him to the synagogue. Because anyone who had recovered from an illness would be brought to the place of worship so they could be declared clean, acceptable once again. And so these neighbors take this man to the synagogue, and the Pharisees start to inquire about the story. They say, okay, so tell us what happened. And he recounts the story about the mud, the spit, the eyes, the washing. They probably said gross too. And then they get a little irritated because all this happened on the Sabbath. Excuse me. Verse 16 says this, some of the Pharisees said about Jesus, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. What do you have to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. And then, for the second time, the man refers to Jesus, but this time he says he is a prophet. And so the Pharisees are divided. On one side, they say, well, this man is breaking our rules, so he can't be from God. And on the other side, some of them say, yeah, but he's doing things only God can do, so he must be from God. They're conflicted. They begin their investigation, and their investigation will go like this. They need to first prove or determine whether or not this man was actually born blind. Because if he wasn't, then we've got nothing to talk about. But if he was, we've got to find out more. And so after they determine whether or not he was actually born blind, they need to find out if he was truly healed, how did it happen, and who did it? And so they send for the man's parents, right? They would be able to determine whether or not this is truly their son, right? Maybe they have a little bit of backstory about what happened. And so the parents come and they say, we have no idea what happened. We have no idea who did it. All we know is this is our boy, and he's been blind since day one. Now, they're a little intimidated because the Pharisees, the religious leaders, had been putting pressure on people, threatening to mistreat or even remove them from the synagogue if they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So the parents are especially timid to say anything about this man that healed their son. And so they say, you're just going to have to talk to him. And so they come back to the man who had been healed. Verse 24 says, a second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. They want to discredit Jesus. If only they can find a sin to pin against him, then that will mean that he can't be perfect, and therefore he isn't God whom he claims to be. And so he says, just say it, admit it. Jesus is a sinner. And the man says, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I do know, maybe the only thing he knew, I was blind, but now I see. They wanted to argue about Jesus. They wanted to turn this miracle into a theological debate. Is he really who he claims to be? Is he a sinner? Is he from God? Did he use the right methods to go about this healing? Did he sin by doing this on the Sabbath? And the man goes, I don't know any of that. The only thing I know is that I used to be blind, and now I can see. They continue to ask how this happened, what Jesus did, and the man goes, I've already told you. Are you wanting to believe in him too? And they get furious with him. They get angry. And they say this, verse 29. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, referring to Jesus, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. See, for this man, it seems so obvious. A miracle has been done. God is at work here. And he goes, surely no one but God could do this, right? He sees it so clearly. And yet for these Pharisees, these religious leaders, it's as if they're missing something. It's as if it's right before their eyes and they're not looking at it. It's as if they can't see, as if they're blind. They don't believe in Jesus. They're looking for every way to discount what has happened. And so in their fury, in their confusion, their misunderstanding, they kick the man out of the synagogue. And then this story resolves. Verse 35, it says, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Just like the story last week, after the miracle, Jesus goes back to find this man. He's not done with him yet. And his question is, do you believe in the Son of Man? And you don't need to know the historical background for that phrase. All you need to know is that it was pulled from the Old Testament, and it referred to the Messiah, the one God would send, the one who is God himself. He goes, do you believe in the Messiah, the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. And Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. In this moment, the man's physical sight and spiritual sight converged. He had been able to see physically in a moment, but his spiritual sight had been coming into focus throughout the whole story. And finally, at this one moment, he's able to look at Jesus. And Jesus uses this miracle to say, the one you're looking at with your newly formed eyes, with your restored sight, the one who stands before you, whom you can see, is the Messiah you've been waiting for. And the man says, I believe it. And he worshiped Jesus. See, this is a story about seeing God at work. It's a story about seeing God at work, and on account of that, believing in Jesus. See, the man sees, but the religious people don't. The man believes, and the Pharisees do not. In this dramatic reversal, the one who is blind to start the story sees Jesus clearly, and those whose eyes were open misses him completely. The ones who had spent their entire lives studying about God and claim to know every answer about him have no idea who Jesus is. And this man who just has Jesus stumble upon him, this man who can't answer a single question, seems to know everything important about Jesus. And so the story ends with this man really seeing and the Pharisees refusing to see. They won't look at Jesus. They won't acknowledge who he is. We have a son who's about 16 months old, and he's old enough to become rebellious at times, right? There are times where he does things we ask him not to do. There are times where we say, do not throw your food off your tray, and he will look at us and he will drop it, right? There are times we tell him, please don't pull the toilet paper endlessly off the roll, right? And he will walk over and just give it a yank. But then he knows he's in trouble because we use a different tone. And at that point, he will not lift his eyes to look at ours, right? Maybe you've seen a child do this before. When they are in trouble, when they are guilty, when they are rebellious, and they know they're busted, they won't look at me. They won't look at you, right? And that's what the Pharisees are doing. They're being rebellious. They're trying to find every way to discount and discredit Jesus, and so they refuse to look at him because they know they're busted. And we do the same thing sometimes. That when we are caught, when we're guilty, when we're running from him, we know he sees, and we know we're not right. And so we refuse to look, and that keeps us from seeing God at work in our lives, and it keeps us from seeing Jesus. And so this story has a ton to teach us, because God is still at work. God is still at work. All around us, constantly, in our lives and in this world. God is at work because he wants people to see him. Just as Jesus predicted that the outcome of this story would be that the works of God would be displayed, in the same way, God is at work because he wants people to see him. And by seeing him at work, we would believe in him. And so the question is not, is God at work in your life, or is that God at work in our world? The question is whether or not we will see it, and whether or not we will let that help us believe. And so I want to make a suggestion coming out of this story, and that is that seeing God's work in our lives can help us believe in Jesus. Seeing God's work in our lives can help us believe in Jesus. This seems like such a simple statement that you might at first dismiss it as a cliche. Please stick with me here. God is at work in your life. And if you are able to acknowledge it, recognize it, see it, and perceive it, then that can buoy your faith to where it wouldn't go on its own. It's what happens in this man's story. He doesn't know much, but when he sees God at work, he starts to believe in Jesus. And the same can happen for us. God is at work. He's doing unique things that only he can do. He's trying to get your attention. He's sending people into your life. He's giving you exactly what you need when you need it. And the question isn't whether or not God is working in your life. The question is whether or not you'll see it. But if you can see God at work in your life uniquely, personally, powerfully, then it can strengthen your faith, and it can help you believe maybe in a way that you never have before. Because when you see God working in your life, it reveals two things about him. The first is that he is powerful, that he is able to interact in our world, and he is even able to do things that no one else can do. But the second thing it reveals about God is that he's not just powerful, but he is also personal. He knows you. He knows exactly what you need. And he is able. And so when you see God at work in your life, it helps you believe by recognizing that your God is both powerful and personal. But if we are honest, we don't always see this, right? I think there are a couple things that keep us from seeing this. The first is that sometimes we are not watching for God to work, right? We're not watching for God to work. He's doing it, but life is busy. It's fast-paced. It's chaotic. We don't have much margin to take a breath and to look around, right? And so he may be working in amazing ways, but we're just not watching it. I overestimate my ability to multitask. I don't know if you do, but I usually think that I can do more at the same time than I actually can. And so if Rachel and I are planning to do some kind of work at home, oftentimes we'll turn on a show that we enjoy together, right? And so I will think that I can go into this doing both, right? But inevitably, after a few moments, something happens in the show, and I have no idea what's going on. There's been this plot twist, or somebody's in trouble, and I have no idea what's happening. And so I go for the remote, because I got to rewind it, right? I don't want to miss it. And Rachel gets frustrated and annoyed because she's way better at multitasking than I am. But I realize in that moment that I've been distracted and I haven't been watching what's before me, right? I think that we probably mostly overestimate our ability to see God at work in our lives. In the midst of the busyness and the chaos that is work and family and sports and commitments and rest and whatever else you need or you do, we overestimate our ability to see through all that, to see God at work right before us. And so sometimes we miss it because we're not really watching. But there are other times, and this is the greater tragedy, when we are not willing to see God at work. It's not that we aren't watching, it's that we're not willing to see him. See, the Pharisees saw Jesus work over and over again. They saw him perform miracles. They saw him do what no one else could do. But in every instance, they tried to discredit it and explain it away. Say that Jesus was a sinner, and so this couldn't possibly be from God. Or say that it was on the Sabbath, and so it didn't really count. And so over and over again, they were not willing to see God at work in their midst. And I wonder how many times God has done something amazing and divine for you. And you do your best to just explain it away because you don't want to, or you're not willing to accept the divine, the supernatural, the thing that God is doing to get your attention. Maybe it's because we're not willing. We chalk it up as a coincidence, or we try to take credit ourselves, or we look for any other way to explain it away. Just like we talked about last week, at the end of every road of faith, there's a gap that can only be bridged by believing in what you cannot see. And when you're not willing to take that leap, you try to explain God's work in our lives in any other way, but saying that it was him. And so we need to watch and we need to be willing. And if we are, then we'll start to see God at work in our lives. And so the question for you is, can you see God's work in your life? It can be difficult at times. And so I want to present to you just a few questions that might jog your memory or increase your awareness. And the first question is this: is there anything that is happening in your life that only God can do? What have you experienced that only God can do? Maybe you experienced comfort or peace in a time when that made absolutely no sense. Something only God can do. Maybe he answered a prayer in a perfect way at just the right time. And you look at that and you go, man, only God could do that. Maybe he provided for you. You were up against a wall. There was no way that you could possibly pay a bill, and a gift came out of nowhere. Almost the exact amount. So has there been a time where you have experienced something in your life that only God could do? That's his work that can help you believe. Another question is, who has been a part of God's work in your life? Maybe he sent someone in at just the right time to comfort you or to confront you or to counsel you or to invite you to come back to church. Maybe God worked through someone to say exactly what you needed to hear. Maybe they were the presence of God in your life that was the comfort you needed, was the wisdom you needed. So who has been that for you? And finally, what change have you experienced that only God can take credit for? Are you able to look around in your life and notice that something is different? And it's not because you took life more seriously or you dug in your heels to make a difference, but it's because the Holy Spirit, God himself, has been working in your life to do something amazing. Maybe your marriage was hanging on by a thread, and you thought there was nothing that could change that. And God reached in and started to do his work and change hearts and bring forgiveness where there was resentment, and now your family is absolutely changed. Maybe you were in a situation that seemed absolutely hopeless. You never thought anything could make a difference, and God worked in such a way as to pull you out of that or to give you a way out, to give you hope. Has there been a change in your life? Maybe you were stuck in some kind of sin that you just could not manage, and God forgave you, and set you free. I don't know what it is, but my guess is that if you are willing and you start watching, that eventually you will see that God is uniquely, personally, powerfully at work in your life, and if only you could acknowledge that, your faith would begin to grow, and Jesus would come into focus. And so there's a second step I want to take with this story. It's not just seeing God at work. There's another step we can take, because I believe that stating God's work in our lives, stating it, saying it simply, succinctly, powerfully, stating God's work in our lives can help us see Jesus, can help us believe in him. So follow this story. This man, there were people arguing about many different things in this man's life, right? Why he was blind, what happened to him. And so over and over again, he was pressed on what happened. Every time he was pressed and questioned, it brought him to a place where he had to state what God did in his life. 3 or 4 times, he had to talk about the nasty loogie dirt, right? He had to talk about Jesus smearing it on his face and going to the pool, and he had to talk about this. But every time, if you follow the story, even though physically he was healed in a moment, what you'll notice is that every time he was brought back to his story, he saw Jesus more clearly. Let me show this to you. Watch this. So Jesus comes into focus in this story. All right, in verse 11, he refers to him as the man they called Jesus. In verse 17, he describes Jesus as a prophet. In verse 33, he says he must be from God. And finally, in verse 38, he says, Lord, I believe. And I believe it was actually this process of stating over and over again God's work in his life that actually helped him to finally believe in him. It helped the mist, the dust to clear. And it brought Jesus into focus. And I believe that it can do the same thing for us. If we are able to somehow simply and powerfully represent God's work in our lives, it can help us to believe in him. Because if we are honest, there is a world that is often inhospitable to faith, that people want to argue about who Jesus is, how much of his life can we really believe, what difference does it make for us anyway? They want to ask questions that can cause doubt to creep in about the Bible or church or faith or God. And so over time, our faith can feel like it's eroding, and we need something to lift it back up. And I believe that if we were able to somehow remind ourselves over and over again how God has personally, powerfully, uniquely, and in a very real way worked in our lives, it can strengthen our faith and help us to hold on. It can actually strengthen our faith and bring Jesus into greater focus. And so my challenge for you is to not only think about how God has worked, but to then go beyond that, to make an attempt to state it, to say it. Now, it may not be quite as obvious as what happens in this story, right? I don't think this man sat down to carefully craft his statement. I don't think that he worked really hard to figure out how to tell people what Jesus did in his life. I think it just naturally flowed off his lips anytime he thought about Jesus. But for us, God's work is often more subtle. I mean, isn't anything more subtle than opening the eyes of a blind man, right? And so God's work is a little more subtle in our lives, and also we can tend to be a little more stubborn. And so it doesn't flow quite as naturally off our lips. But I believe that if God has worked personally and powerfully in our life to help us believe in Jesus, then isn't it worth a few moments of reflection to figure out how to state it for ourselves so that it can keep strengthening us and helping Jesus to come into focus? And so in a moment, I'm going to ask you to do that. But before I do that, I would like to share with you a few of my statements. So I was once stuck in a destructive cycle of sin that I could not get out of on my own. And Jesus forgave me of that, and he set me free. I was once plagued with a hardened heart of bitterness and resentment because of hurt that someone inflicted on me. And Jesus brought me to a point of forgiveness and peace. After a series of miscarriages, my family was wrecked by grief. But Jesus comforted us. He healed our hearts, and he helped us to trust him in the midst of it. I was once prideful, legalistic, and judgmental toward everyone around me, and God broke me. He humbled me, and he showed me how much I need Jesus. I was once almost crushed under the pressure of stress in the name of achievement and success. But now I'm content with with whatever God chooses to accomplish through me. I would be so different without him. And these statements may inspire you, but they are for me to make the gospel real to me. And so when I start to doubt, when people around me want to question, I come back to this. And I say, I don't care what anyone says. I don't care what anyone wants to debate or argue or claim, because I know that my God is real, because over and over again in my life, he has worked. And I am different because of it. And those statements stand as pillars that hold up my faith and keep me strong. And there is nothing you or anyone can say to chip away at that, because I know that God has worked in my life. And it helps me to believe. And so because life is fast-paced and we often move through it without stopping for a moment to pay attention to how God has worked, we want to create that moment in this service for you today. And so in just a moment, I'm going to pray, and the band will come up. And as they play this song that speaks of the relentless pursuit of God, I want to encourage you to reach under your chair and to pull out a card that looks like this. We have given you a little guidance in how to state God's work in your life. You don't have to use that. You can flip it over to the blank side and write your own story however you want to represent it. But the challenge for you over the next few moments as the band plays in front of you is to reflect on how God has uniquely worked in your life. What is your story? You understand that? The Almighty God has stepped into your life with all of his unlimited power to personally meet your needs and get your attention so that you would believe in Jesus. He's chasing after you. He loves you and wants to draw you closer to him. And when you notice that, it can strengthen your faith. It can help you to know God as the personal and powerful God that he is. It can make the gospel real to you. And so let me pray. Holy Spirit, you know each of us. You see every moment of our life. And so I pray now that you would illuminate what you want us to see. That you would bring to mind the ways that you have worked relentlessly, carefully, precisely, and powerfully in our lives, that we would know you and believe in you. Would you help each of us to state your work so that we might strengthen our faith and see Jesus more clearly? In his precious name I pray, amen.